You roll? Okay. Okay, I want to talk about something Shavuostic. We'll take a break from Shabbos for a little bit, talk about something Shavuostic. It's a little bit some famous information, but I hope there's also going to be some stuff that's not so famous that maybe it could be meisif. I want to talk about Akdamas. So everybody knows the minig in Kilas Ashkenaz is that by Kriyas HaTorah in the morning, on Shavuos morning, at some point before they start, or right when they start Kriyas HaTorah, we say a long pisma, Akdamas Milin, very hard words. And basically what it is it gives like a background to the, call it the cosmic nature of Matan Torah, like how consequential it is, like HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Malachim, Klal Yisrael. Like it makes it very big, like it really plays up the whole, how consequential and how cosmic Matan Torah was. Now, who made up the song? When was it instituted to say it? Why do we say it in the place that we say it? The different halachic, discussions about that. That's what I want to spend some time on. Now, just before I start, one of the main players, contributors in this sugya is the Shailas Tshuva Shar Ephraim. Now, I think most people, it's not a famous Tshuva sefer, the Shar Ephraim. So I want to use this opportunity just to memorialize the Shar Ephraim a little bit because I don't think it's not such a well-known Tshuva sefer. Talk about him for a drop and then we'll come back to what he does with Hakdamas. So a lot of what we know about the Shar Ephraim is because the Shar Ephraim was the Chacham Tzvi's grandfather. So the Rabbi Yaakov Emden's great-grandfather, and Rabbi Yaakov Emden in Megillah Sefer spends, a good couple of pages describing his illustrious, his yichus, his great-grandfather, the Shar Ephraim. Now, the Shar Ephraim is one volume of Chuvas. It was reprinted recently. Two fascinating nekudas that I want to talk about him. The first one is as follows. The Shar Ephraim is a Ephraim HaKohen of Vilna. So he's a good Litvish Jew. He eventually, there's wars, there's Magefa, and he's not able to stay at home where he's comfortable. He has to travel. He ends up after a few stops, he ends up in Oder, which is one of the three cities that eventually becomes Budapest. Like Budapest is an amalgamation of three different cities around the river. Ultimately, it becomes the modern city of Budapest, but this is the city that he ends up in the 1600s. He's a Talmud L'Chakas Mechaykik, so an early Achron. He ends up over there. Now, at that time, Oder was part of the Ottoman Empire, so he's like a very Litvish Apaisik who ends up doing a lot of corresponding with Svardim in Eretz Yisrael, Svardim in Tzfas, that he talks to. So it's like a very interesting interplay. His Chuvas, a lot of times, are very interesting, like he's conversing with Paiskim from a very, very different background than where he's coming from. So it makes for some interesting conversations. And one of them is actually about Akdamas. But now, before that, there's two unique, interesting things that happened in his life. The first thing is that when he came to the town of Oder, there was it's Oiban, not Oder. Oder's in a German town. Oiban. It's the town of Oiban. He becomes the Rav there. And not long after he becomes the Rav there, he does a shidduch. He marries off a son to one of the local Parnesim in the town, to a daughter of one of the local Parnesim. Now it seems that before he had been there had been an exera made by someone Rav Feivish, who had been a Rav there previously, where in order to stop cabals from forming, he had made exera that the town and anyone who was part of of its environs cannot hire a Rav who has any familiar relationships in the town. You can't hire a Rav if his kids live in the town, or his Adams live in the town, or his Mochatanim live in the town, because that's a good way to have fraud, to end up hiring people that don't belong in the job. So he made such a gzeira. Now, when the Ephraim HaKohen of Vilna became the Rav in Oiban, and then he does a shidduch in the town, so some Misnagdim got up immediately and said, you're in violation of Rav Ori Faivish's gzeira. This is a familial shidduch now. You're now, have family in the town, and it's not acceptable. You have to give up the shteller. Now, in Tshuva Samach, in the Shar Ephraim, he actually discusses in a few Tshuvas back and forth the different Paiskim who got involved in this Shaila, and ultimately they write to the Geyser HaGzeru who had moved to Eretz Yisrael to give a little better explanation of his Gzeru. What did he include? What did he mean to include in it? And Rav Feivish writes back that he never meant to include a shidduch that happens, post-op. He only meant the shidduch that happens if you're related in advance, where it's going to create either an element of some impropriety in the whole hiring process. That's what he meant. But if you were hired, regular betam libcha, and then you do a shidduch, he never said to be aser, and the Misnagdim settle down, and Ephraim HaKohen is able to become the Rav of Oiban, and that's where he lives out his life. Now, the extremely tragic and very unique storyline to this Tshuva Sefer is as follows. In the Akdama, there's Akdama Ben HaMechaber to the Shar Ephraim. And in the Akdama from the Ben HaMechaber, he writes as follows. And this is a wild story. He says, we got to Oban, we settled down, we had a family here. He says, and then, V'hine b'yam me'el yam shel tzar b'shnas taf lamed ches. In the year, what is that? 1670 something, right? 1678. It says in the year 1678, he says, Bizman HaMagefa, there was a big Magefa that hit the town. Rischa tachfu aleinu royis rabbis v'tzaris tzara tzara nigsha. It was like wave after wave of tzaris, washed over us. He says, V'zeh yatz rishayna, v'avenisenu rabbim b'noi hagadol, hay achi. My older brother, who was a local over here, he caught the disease, and he had it for a week. And be'erev Shabbos Kodesh b'yom Misa Shmuel Ramasi Chavches Le'ir Balim Nuchasiv B'malei Shimshi. He dies in a week after having the illness. He says, Hu Agvir HaChacham Amaroimim Hoylech Tamim. He talks about his brother a little bit. Rav Chizkiyahu Akayin Evan Harosh Fine. Oile Rabbana Shem Mekaveres is Balea Ben Shleishim Shana Ba'amdul Mefem Melech Malchus Shalaylam. He was 30 years old when he succumbed to this plague, and he dies. He says, Hatzor Tamim Pa'alei B'chol Masav. Okay. Then he says as follows. Then he says, "Ulemishma oizin daven afshenu." Something really tragic took place. He said, "Sheba shiva, yimei evel achi." During the shiva for my brother who died, and he yesiv and achlesi makeseh anusha. I became ill with this magefa that was sweeping through the town. He says, "Kibad Yehuda makas magefa." Fine. He says, "I got very sick." V'hi kishmaya hadavar. When my father heard about this, he says, "Hisatif b'talisa." He wrapped himself up in his talis. V'kapa of prusas hashemayim. He outstretched his hands to the shemayim. V'tchinu bakasha, with a deep plea. V'kacha ya'imer hakayin hagadol b'tfilasa. And this is what my father, the kayin hagadol, Ephraim hakayin of Vilna, said in his tefillah. Ana Hashem, yehi nafshi tachas nefesh b'ni. He says, please Hashem, let my nefesh be in place of the nefesh of my son. Yedidi yichidi ben zekunim huli. He's my only remaining son who's alive. He's my ben zekunim. Hashivan of asay miyitin moisi tachtecha b'schus Yitzchak Avinu haneket keseh. My father asked, let me be able to die instead of my son, and not have to, and like the Akedah. Shami kol dvarov, nehi uvechi yeshavti alerish dvai v'arkavil. Says, I cried, I sat, and then suddenly he says, v'nefchut tzira like chav li'isha v'evke v'arimaisi koli, he cries. Then he says, v'idenu oimid b'tfila. My father was still standing and davening in the corner. L'fnei el ram v'nisa, v'hine yad Hashem nagabi, and suddenly I felt like the hand of Hashem touching me, v'yar Ephraim escholya v'Yehuda es mezarei, v'tigze v'yakum le'ha'omer v'oiseh, and suddenly I got better. He says, and in a short time, my father came down with the illness, and within a few more days, my father was on his deathbed. And he says, he calls me to his bed, and he tells me, you're my only son, you're my ben zekunim, you're what I have left. He was a bacher still when this happened, the son. I know that I don't have long on this world anymore, I'm going to be gone soon. I'm asking you, please, the one thing you can do for me is publish my svarim. I want you to publish the Machne Ephraim on Chumash, and I want you to publish the Sha'ar Ephraim on Halacha, these tshuvas that he wrote. And the son he writes that he tearfully commits to publishing his father's svarim, and sadly the Machne Ephraim al Chumash was actually never published. It's in manuscript still, he never got around to it. And then he writes in the rest of the Akdama how his whole life he traveled till he put together the money. He writes like what took so long, what the delay was before he was able to publish his svarim, and ultimately he publishes the Sha'ar Ephraim. Now the Sha'ar Ephraim himself dies at 62 years old. Not a terribly old man, but I guess for those days, an old man. And he sacrificed his life by his son's account for his son to live and publish his svarim. And this is not like a hearsay story somebody said about somebody. This is in the Hakdamas Ben Mechaber from the late 1600s. Now, so this is a little bit about the Sha'ar Ephraim. I just wanted to use the opportunity when we're going to talk about a tshuva from the Sha'ar Ephraim, just to talk about who the Sha'ar Ephraim was. Now, so what's the shmuz? So I think everybody's familiar with the story with Hakdamas, right? So Hakdamas is made up by Reb Meir shliach tzibur. Now, Reb Meir shliach tzibur is a very interesting character. He's one of Rashi's Rebbeim. Rashi in Siddur Rashi quotes him. Rashi in Navi in a few places quotes him, brings down things from Reb Meir shliach tzibur. So he's one of Rashi's Rebbeim, maybe not the main Rebbe of Rashi, but one of Rashi's Rebbeim, someone Rashi held as a Rebbe. Now, the story that's told about him, it comes down in a few different versions. Grada, the El Yerabba in Siman Taf Tzadik Dalet and Shulchan Aruch makes mention to the story, in his halacha, in regarding a halacha nafkamina, but there's a lot of versions. I'm going to say, I guess, the easiest one to say over. The easiest story to say over about Rav Meir Shliach Tzibur is as follows. Rav Meir Shliach Tzibur, and this is brought down in many old, story books, he was an outsider. Rav Meir Shliach Tzibur was someone from the Aseres HaShvatim. And the story goes as follows. There was I'll read it from one of the versions, but the story goes as follows. There was a shade who was a big Kishuf Rebbe. And basically how it was is, and I can't exactly explain why it works this way. The shed was tied to like a wheel on top of a mountain, outside Chutz Le'ir, in an isolated area. And what you would do is 10 people would come learn from him at one shot from the shade to learn Kishuf. And his payment was that at the end of the Kishiv lesson, he would select one of the 10 people and he would kill him. So it was like a very dangerous Kishiv roulette. You got taught Kishiv by him, but one of the 10 people would be killed. Now it seems that there were Jewish groups who would go learn from Kishiv as well. And there was a group that came that included a Jew in its ranks. And he felt like he was catching the eye of the master too much. He felt like the shade had his eye set on him, and he was going to be the carbon at the end of this lesson. So to avoid that, he shouted out, Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. The shade became frightened and broke the wheel that he had there, killed all 10 who were studying with him at the time, and fled and left the scene. Now, there was a Talmud of the shed, whose name is brought down in the story for what it's worth, who was very bothered by this and blamed the Jews for ruining the Kishiv pipeline. There was a way to learn Kishiv, he ruined it. He was very, very upset at the Jews, and he started killing Jews, through Kishiv. Now, eventually, they reached like a negotiated settlement with him, where they agreed that he'll stop killing Jews. Al Tanai, that at a later date in time, a year down the line, they'll have a one-off, like a one-on-one. We'll select our best, Kishiv person. You'll select your best Kishiv, and they'll go head-to-head. Whoever wins will win. Now, they didn't have anybody local in the Rhine, in that part of Germany, who could go up against this Kishiv Macher. So what they did is, they sent a message to the Aseres HaShvatim on the other side of the Sambatyan, and they said, we need someone who could come and save us, someone who knows Kishiv who could come save us. And Reb Meir shliach tzibur was selected by the Aseres HaShvatim, ostensibly, to come, fight this battle against this Kishiv master who was threatening the Jews. And he's able to travel, on Shabbos because it's Pikuach Nefesh, right? Meaning we know the Sambatya in the rocks, it can't he can't get out because the rocks, but on Shabbos it rests. So on his way there, it's Pikuach Nefesh, he's going to save Klal Yisrael on the Rhine, he's allowed to do it. But since there's no Pikuach Nefesh to go home, he's not able to go home, and he stays, after defeating this Kishiv master, he stays over in Germany, and he teaches some things, he makes some songs, he teaches some things, and he becomes, a Rebbe of sorts to some of the Gedei Rishonim, to some of Rashi v'Chaverov. Now, I don't know, the story's brought down in many different places, I can't tell you, I don't know. Azai Zakman, this is a story that's said as the origin for the Tefillah of Akdamis. Now, he composes this Tefillah of Akdamis, and Klal Yisrael, at least Ashkenazi Chilek of Klal Yisrael, took it on to say this Shavuos morning. There's already in Sidurim from like 800 years ago, you'll see this tefillah already there. So it's a very old tefillah. Klal Yisrael accepted a long time ago, and it's been pretty much a constant ever since then to stay in the liturgy in the tefillah of Shavuos. Now, so there's a few nekudas that are worth discussing. A simple nekuda is, why is it in Aramaic? Right? We know every time the tefillah is in Aramaic, it's an eyebrow raiser. You have to figure out why it is. So that's the Mashal Brich Shmei comes from the Zohar. There are tefillahs that come from the Zohar that made it into the Siddur tefillah. Why is a tefillah that was composed in 1050 in Germany in Aramaic? It should be in Lashon HaKodesh. Now there's a lot of different theories that were given for why it's in Aramaic. Some say it's such a heilige song that we don't want the Malachim to understand. Some say other things. A lot of different theories that are given. Now, Pashas, the truest theory of them all, is as follows: that there was a minig back in the day, Bimei Chazal. The Gemara in Megillah talks about in Daf Gimel and in Daf Chav Daled. The Gemara talks about this minig, meaning a din, that when they would be Kaira the Torah B'Rabim, they'd be Metargim the Torah as well. Right? In Bavel, the minig was the Baal Kaira would read the pasuk, and then the Metargim would say what the taich of the pasuk is, and they would go Chayna v'Chayna. Ad Kedekach, that the Gemara in Megillah says many dinim. The Gemara says that the Kaira the Metargim is not allowed to start until the Kaira is completed, and tziburs is not allowed to answer until the Metargim is done, and then the Kaira is not allowed to start. There's like rules that the Gemara tells us about how it's supposed to be Kaira, Kaira and Metargim. For example, there are dinim, certain parshias are Kaira and Ve'ena Metargim. Like you don't Metargim them because they have negative or they're bad, right? So we don't. Meaning there was a din that parshias would get Targum b'shas ma'aseh b'kriyas HaTorah. Now, this is gebracht in the Torah and Shulchan Aruch, but in the Torah and Shulchan Aruch it already says clearly that this minig has fallen into this use. Meaning in the Shulchan Aruch it says, "V'achshav we're not knowing to do this minig," and the Mela it's not. The Shulchan Aruch says in Hilchos Kriyas HaTorah, "V'ha'idna leinagu l'targim mishum dematei b'targim kivin shein mevinu naisei." It's 6 to 1, half a dozen the other. If the Elam doesn't understand the psukim, they're also not going to understand the targum. So there's no point in reading targum. So the Shulchan Aruch and really the Torah already does away with this din of current psukim and targum. Now it seems from many different old minhagim svarim, from German old minhagim svarim, amongst them Lashon Archas Chaim, the Kolboi, Sefer HaManig, bring that on Shavuos and Pesach the minig was still to be metargim, even though targum fell into disuse and you weren't metargim psukim anymore. But on Shavuos and Pesach they are metargim. Now, what's the reason that's given? So Rather, Taisvis in Megillah, Daf Chavdalad brings it down. But Taisvis says, like a Shleim Stichzach, Taisvis says, Hashan Metargim and Hafteris, Shal Shvi Shal Pesach V'Atzeres, Tvei Mishar Yom Tovim. This that will Metargim the Maftir of Atzeres and of Shavuos and Shvi Shal Pesach. V'Shein Medabris B'Nes Hayoim K'dei Lefarsem Hanes. It talks about the Nes Hayoim, and in order to be Mefarsim the Nes, we're Metargim it. V'chein b'Matan Torah K'dei Lefarsem Hanes. Likewise, Matan Torah, in order to be Mefarsim the Nes, we're Metargim it. Now, the real question is that what's the Nes of Matan Torah? There is no, meaning Pesach, we lay in Shvi Shal Pesach makes perfect sense. You're learning about Kriyas Yamsuf, you're learning about probably the most marvelous Nes that ever happened in Klal Yisrael's history. But on Shavuos, what Nes are we trying to be Magdal exactly? So, other Rishonim are more masber, it's meduik like this in the Machzavitri, maybe others, that the Nes is the Maimed Har Sinai. Meaning the Maimed Har Sinai, which was taka supernatural, which was different, that made such a ratio in Klal Yisrael, like the Rambam said that Terry says that the Maimed Har Sinai is like the even more important for the Ikrei Emunah than Kriyas Yamsuf. Like it's a bigger Nes that happened in Maimed Har Sinai that happened. So there's the Nes of Matan Torah of Maimed Har Sinai that's that's worth pumping up and doing the Targum. Now it seems that back then the minig was that after every Aliyah they read a Targum, and there was different piyutim. They were called Debraya, maybe, I think. Taisus refers to it somewhere. Taisus says, like, we don't say the Debraya, the Torah brings it down. I think there was like piyutim of Targum that were written for each part of the Kriya on Shavuos and Pesach, but over time they fell into disuse. But Mistama, the reason why this was written in Targum is because this was like a psicha to the Targum. Meaning the minig was to be with Targum, the Psukim, still in Shavuos. So as a psicha to the Targum, this Akdamas Milim is written, which means Akdama. Akdamas Milim, like let me give you a little bit of Akdama to what we're about to talk about over here, and then it would be done with the Targum. So Mil, it was done in Targum. Matched, it had to do with Targum. But this could also explain, just hold this aside for a second, this will also explain one of the other big shilas. Now the other big mavucha that comes up with Akdamas is where to say it. Today, in most Kehilas, the minig is to say it before you start the Kriyas HaTorah. But the original minig, as brought down, even in the Maril and Rav Isaac Turna and any one of the old German minhagim svarim, the way they bring it down is to say Akdamis after the first pasuk. The Oila comes up, he makes a bracha, the Balkari reads the first pasuk, they pause, and then they say Akdamis. Now this was a big fight, and I want to go into that in a second, but if you understand that really what this was a psicha to the Targum, then it kind of makes sense. Because you're not saying it beforehand. It's not a psicha to the kriya. First, you have to be kaira. You say a pasuk, and then before you start saying the first targum of this whole kriya, you say the akdamas milun. So its placement actually makes sense when you understand like this. Now, these are none of this is settled, but meaning the placement makes sense. Now, so how and why did it get moved? So the Taz in Siman Taf Tzadik Dalad is the first one to be meir. The Taz writes very strongly that he doesn't understand. If you make the brachas first, so it's a hefsek between the brachas and the kriya. If you start reading the kriya, it's a hefsek between the brachas and the kriya again, because you have to finish the kriya. If you do it after 2 psukim, so according to some days, you're already yaitza, so the kriya is done. Do it after 3 psukim, and there's no shaykhs to the kriya. So he says, just do it beforehand. It's a hakdama to the whole thing, just do it beforehand and leave it aside. As I like the Taz. Now, even b'shaitai, in the Taz's time, there was many chalkim on the Taz. L'mashal, the Shvus Yaakov, the Chak Yaakov, even the Magen Avram, in Hilchos Kriyas HaTorah, in Kufman Daled, brings down that the minig was not to do it like the Taz. Like even the Magen Avram still, who's later, or dar later than the Taz, brings down that the Taz wasn't mamish accepted. Now, like to show Adechan Advar Magiyim, there's a story that they say over. The Shvus Yaakov references that Shamati the Chak Yaakov later on references Shamati al Rav Chashuv Echad. The Welt says he's talking about the Shagasari, that supposedly the Shagasari, when he came to Metz, he wanted to institute the Taz's Takana. He came there and the minig was that they would do Akdamis after the first pasuk. And he says, it's not richtig. The Taz says that's not the way to do it. And he wanted to be sakin it and move it to beforehand. And the Balabatim had major pushback. He said, no, it's an alta minig in Shtat over here. You don't chepazich with the minhagim of Shtat. You don't change any of the minhagim. And the Shagasari was very embittered by this. And they say that when it came time, at the end of the year, at the end of every year, in those olden day Kehilas, the Rav had to sign the Pinchas book. Like you'd sign at the end of the year, like Hakol Shar V'Kayim. When they brought the Pinchas book to the Shagasari to sign, he wrote in the Aseres HaDibros, and then he signed. And when they asked him, like, what shaykhs were writing Aseres HaDibros, he says, I see you, Chaver, are very, very makbid on whatever it says in your minig book. I figured if I write the Aseres HaDibros, maybe you'll keep those too. So the Shagasari was like embittered by this story in Metz that happened. As I said, this is a story that's gebracht, in different sources. Now, Yirch Shia, the Taz writes that it should be fixed. Now, the Magen Avram, others are chaylik on him. But Lamaisa, by the time it comes to the Tkuf of the Mishnah Brura, so there already, the Mishnah Brura writes that the minig is to do it beforehand anymore, and like it's fixed. The Welt does like the Taz now. Now, what was taka the rationale to do it, the way the old minig was? So we said one reason. One reason is l'chayr because it's a psichat targum, and targum starts after you finish the first pasuk. Now, the other reason that's given, and this comes from the Al Yerabah. The Al Yerabah says he suggests. The Al Yerabah suggests ulai mipnei ma'isa hayudua she'ira bamidbar. Now the first pasuk of the kriya ends with the word bamidbar. It's a short pasuk. It's 5 words. I'm blanking the second, but it ends with the word bamidbar. So the Al Yerabah writes that since the story he's referring to this ma'isa hayudua. Now he didn't have the girsa that I said over, because the girsa that I said over has nothing to do with the midbar. But there is older girsas and other girsas that say like that the place the battle happened with great detail, like with spinning wheel, like real great detail of how the shade was killed by like grinding wheels that were stuck in the sky in orbit, like real crazy details that happened in the midbar. So the Yerabah is referring to this ma'isi yadua that of which I said over a version, and says that maybe that's the reason why they said it, where they said it. They placed it right after Bamidbar. Right after we read the word Bamidbar, we say, oh, you want to hear what happened Bamidbar? Let's do a meir, shliach, tziburs, contribution on Bamidbar. Others give different reasons. They're less negay, Others go down the whole idea of saying piyutim and krevitz and taisvus and etc. But I think these are the two most severe reasons for why the minig was like that. But l'maisa today, the minig's not like that anymore. Today we say akdamis, beforehand, like the Taz, and I guess we get the best of both worlds, because you get to mention the tefillah of akdamis with how, the chashav, beautiful tefillah that it is, albeit not many people understand the words, and at the same time you don't have to comment any shilas of hafsekim and brachas and kriyas hatayra. Okay.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.